Ever feel like some of these ABA terms are a little bit like trying to solve a puzzle? Things like stimulus control
Yeah.
or prompt fading.
I know what you mean.
Like, you get the big picture, right?
Yeah.
Helping someone be more independent.
Yeah.
But sometimes the actual how-to, like how do we actually do this?
Right.
That can get a little fuzzy.
Yeah.
So today we're really going to dig into some core strategies in applied behavior analysis. Specifically, how can we change the cues that trigger behavior, kind of on purpose, to help someone learn to do things on their own?
Absolutely. And it's all about transferring that control, like you were saying. Going from needing our support to them being able to respond based on cues they naturally see in the environment. And we're going to do that by breaking down some key ABA techniques that you use all the time.
Okay, so we've got this deep dive planned. Based on all the research and practical applications out there in behavior analysis,
That's right.
where do you want to start?
Well, why don't we start with something that I think a lot of people have at least heard of, even if they don't know exactly what it means: delayed prompting.
Yeah, delayed prompting. It sounds kind of technical, but the idea is pretty simple. I mean, basically, you give a prompt, like any extra help, but you give it a little bit after you give the actual instruction.
Right. So initially you might be giving a prompt immediately with the instruction, but then you're gradually going to increase that time.
You're waiting longer and longer.
Exactly. And you might hear some other terms used for delayed prompting, like progressive time delay or constant time delay.
Time to wait.
And they're really all getting at the same idea, which is we're delaying that prompt.
Okay, so different labels, same basic idea. Now, give me an example of how this might actually look in practice.
Okay, sure. Imagine you're teaching someone to say hello when you wave to them. So at first you might wave and then immediately say hello.
Right.
But with delayed prompting, you'd wave and then wait just a second and then say hello.
So you're giving them a chance to say it.
Exactly. And then maybe wait 2 seconds and 3 seconds and so on.
Oh, okay.
So you're gradually increasing that delay.
You're creating those little opportunities.
Right. And the research shows that delayed prompting is really good because it allows the learner to respond independently if they can. And sometimes they can, They have the skill, but they're not consistently using it. It gives them that opportunity to try it on their own first.
Yeah. And I like that you're not changing the original instruction. You're keeping that consistent.
Exactly. And it also allows for what we call a really clear moment of transfer.
Moment of transfer.
Yeah. And that means that eventually, the instruction that you're giving, or what we call the discriminative stimulus, becomes the prompt.
Okay. So in our example, the waving becomes the prompt for saying hello.
Exactly. So they no longer need that verbal prompt from you. They just hear wave and they know, oh, I'm supposed to say hello.
Okay. Now, when you're using delayed prompting, what are some things you need to be careful about? Like, are there times when it wouldn't be appropriate to use this or?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing is that the response that you're trying to teach already has to be in the person's repertoire.
Okay. So they have to at least be able to do it sometimes.
Right. So if they've never said hello before, then just waiting longer isn't going to teach them how to say hello.
Right. If they don't know the skill at all, then delaying the prompt isn't going to help.
Right. You would need to teach that skill first.
Okay. Got it. So what else?
So another potential disadvantage is that some people might never emit the response without the prompt.
So they might always need that little extra help.
Yeah. And that's okay.
Okay.
It's good to be aware of that.
Yeah. It's good to keep in mind. So is there anything else?
Well, we also want to be aware that we might see incorrect responses during that delay.
During that pause.
Yes.
Okay.
So, we want to have a plan. If we see an incorrect response, how are we going to handle that?
Okay. So be prepared for those errors.
Yes.
That makes sense. Yeah. So how do we make sure that we're using delayed prompting effectively? Are there any tips or things from the research that can help us?
Yeah, and I think the key is to increase that delay systematically.
Okay.
So start with a very brief delay, like we said, maybe just a second.
1 second. Okay.
And then only increase it once the learner starts responding correctly, at least some of the time.
Some of that. Okay.
Right. And you're going to find that sweet spot where you're giving them enough time, but not so much time that they're getting frustrated or giving up.
Okay.
Yeah.
So gradual progress, basically.
Yes.
Now, we were talking about delayed prompting, and you mentioned progressive and graduated.
Right.
Is graduated prompting the same as delayed prompting?
No, it's not the same.
Okay. So what is it? So graduated prompting is a little bit different. You might also hear it called increasing assistance.
And with graduated prompting, you're starting with the least intrusive prompt, And you're only going to increase the level of assistance if the learner doesn't respond correctly.
Okay. So it's not about the timing so much as the type of prompt that you're giving.
Right,
Can you
exactly.
give me an example?
Okay. Let's say you're teaching someone to open a container. So you might start with a verbal prompt, something like, twist the lid.
Okay. A verbal prompt.
Right. And if they don't do it, then you might give a gestural prompt. You might point to the lid and make a twisting motion with your hand.
Okay.
And then if they still need help, you might model the action, like actually show them how to twist the lid.
Okay.
And then if they still need help, you can provide hand-over-hand physical guidance.
Oh, okay. So you're kind of moving up a ladder of assistance, only giving more help if they need it.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned something about maximum to minimum prompting.
Right.
How does that relate to this?
Yeah, so maximum to minimum prompt reduction is basically the opposite of graduated prompting. So you're starting with the most assistance and then gradually decreasing it. So graduated prompting, or minimum to maximum, can be really useful when you think the learner has some understanding of the task.
Okay.
Or they can do parts of it, but they need a little nudge.
Okay.
And then maximum to minimum might be better when you're teaching a completely new skill.
Oh, I see. So if they're brand new to it, give them all the help they need.
Exactly.
And then gradually feed it back.
Yes. And with graduated prompting, it's really important to determine what we call the functional prompt level.
Functional prompt level.
Yeah. Which is the least intrusive prompt that consistently gets the correct response.
Okay, so find the least amount of help that works.
Yes, and start there.
Start there.
And only increase the intrusiveness if you need to.
Got it. Okay, now let's move on to fading. Is fading like basically making something disappear gradually?
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
Okay.
So in ABA, fading is when you're gradually removing a prompt while the behavior's still happening in the presence of that instruction.
Okay.
So the goal of fading is to transfer stimulus control from that prompt to the natural stimulus.
Okay, so we want them to respond to the thing that's naturally there, not just because we're giving them a hint.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Can you give me an example of fading?
Yeah. So let's say you're teaching a child to identify a picture of a dog. So initially you might say, dog, and point to the picture.
Okay.
So the pointing is the prompt.
Okay.
And then to fade that prompt, you might just point to the picture without saying dog.
Okay.
And eventually you would just show the picture and say, what is it?
So you've completely faded out that verbal prompt.
Exactly.
Okay. So there are different types of fading, right?
Right.
What are those?
So one type is stimulus fading. And that's when you're changing some physical dimension of the prompt itself.
Okay. So the prompt itself is actually changing.
Right.
Okay. Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah. So a common example is teaching someone to recognize their name written down. You might start by writing their name in a really bright color.
Oh.
And then gradually make that color less and less intense until it looks just like any other word on the page.
So the color prompt has been faded.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So what are the other types?
So the other main type is prompt fading. And that's when you're reducing how much help you're giving, or the intrusiveness of the prompt.
Okay.
And actually, both delayed prompting and graduated prompting are types of prompt fading.
Oh, okay.
So with delayed prompting, you're fading by increasing that time
Okay.
before the prompt. And then with graduated prompting, you're fading by starting with a less intrusive prompt
Okay.
and only moving to a more intrusive prompt if needed.
Okay. So you're always trying to use the least amount of help that's going to work.
Right. Exactly. And the research mentions that you can fade different kinds of prompts. You can fade visual prompts. You can fade auditory prompts. You can fade tactile prompts.
Sensical prompts, okay.
Exactly.
Now, the research also mentioned something called errorless learning.
Right.
What is that, and how does that relate to fading?
So errorless learning is basically an approach where you're trying to minimize errors during the learning process. And one way to do that is with something called within stimulus prompt fading.
Within stimulus prompt fading. Okay.
Yeah, and that's where the prompt is actually embedded in the stimulus itself.
Okay.
So the idea is you're making it really obvious what the correct response is.
Okay.
And this can be helpful because it can prevent the learner from making a lot of errors.
Okay. And you're still fading that out.
Right. So you would gradually reduce or remove that prompt as the learner starts to get it.
So can you give me an example of a within stimulus prompt?
Yeah, so let's say you're teaching someone to select the letter A from a group of letters.
Okay.
So within stimulus prompt might be to make the letter A really big,
Okay.
or maybe a different color.
Okay, so make it stand out.
Exactly. And then as they start to learn to select the letter A consistently, you would gradually make it the same size and color as the other letters.
Oh, I see. So you're fading that prompt out.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, the research also mentions something called stimulus equalization.
Right?
Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. So that's where you're initially presenting all the stimuli in a very similar way.
Okay.
And you only provide reinforcement when they interact with the correct stimulus.
Okay.
So the idea is that the incorrect stimuli will gradually lose their control over the learner's behavior because they're not being reinforced.
Oh, okay. So the right answer is the only one that's getting them something good.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. So what are the overall benefits of using these fading techniques?
So the big benefit is that you're promoting more natural stimulus control.
Okay.
So the learner starts responding to the cues that are naturally present in their environment rather than relying on those artificial prompts.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And that also helps with generalization.
Okay. And generalization means that they can use the skill in different situations.
Right. With different people in different places.
Okay.
So it becomes more useful.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what are some challenges that we might face when we're using fading?
Yeah. So one challenge is making sure that you fade the prompts gradually enough.
Okay.
If you fade too quickly, the learner might start making mistakes.
Right.
Or they might get frustrated. And you also need to think about motivation.
Okay.
So sometimes when we're providing prompts, it can feel more secure for the learner.
Okay.
So as you start to fade those prompts, you want to make sure that they're still experiencing success
Okay.
and getting reinforcement.
Okay. So it's a balancing act
Right.
between providing enough support, but also encouraging them to be more independent. Okay. So let's talk about response delay.
Okay.
Now, is that different than delayed prompting?
Yes, it is different.
Okay. Tell me about it.
So response delay is when you're pausing after you give the instruction, but before the learner has a chance to respond.
Okay. So it's the pause before they even have a chance to answer.
Right. And the key here is that you're delaying the response opportunity before you provide any prompts.
Okay. Got it. Can you give me a quick example?
Yeah. So if you ask someone, what color is this? And you show them a blue block, you might wait a few seconds before saying anything else.
Okay. So that little pause, that's the response delay.
Right.
Okay. So what's the point of doing that?
So the research shows that response delay can help to prevent prompt dependency.
Okay.
Because if we always jump in and provide a prompt, then the learner might learn to just wait for the prompt.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, instead of trying to answer on their own.
Okay.
And the research also suggests that response delay can actually help to reduce impulsivity
Oh,
because it gives the individual a little bit of time to think before they respond.
okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, how long should that delay be?
Yeah, so the length of the delay is going to depend on the learner and the task.
Okay.
If it's too short, they might not have enough time to process and respond.
Right.
And if it's too long, they might lose focus.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just like a set number of seconds.
Right.
It depends.
Okay.
Got it. Now, let's talk about within stimulus and extra stimulus prompts.
Okay.
And I know we talked about within stimulus prompts a little bit when we were talking about fading.
Right.
So can you just remind me what the difference is between these two?
Yeah, so the main difference is where the prompt is coming from. So within stimulus prompts involve changing something about the stimulus itself to make the correct answer more obvious.
Okay.
And then extra stimulus prompts are those additional cues that you're adding to the environment.
Okay, so within is changing the thing itself.
Right.
And extra is adding something to the environment.
Exactly.
Okay. Can you give me an example of each?
Yeah, so we talked about the example of the letter A before.
Right.
So making the letter A bigger or a different color, that would be a within stimulus prompt.
All right.
And then an extra stimulus prompt would be if you pointed to the letter A, or if you said something like, it's the first letter of the alphabet.
Okay, so those are cues that you're adding.
Right.
Got it. Okay. Now, the research mentioned that within stimulus prompts can be particularly helpful for errorless learning and fading.
Right.
Why is that?
So because within stimulus prompts, the prompt is already embedded in the thing that you're trying to teach.
Okay.
So it can help to guide them to the correct response in a way that's less intrusive than an extra stimulus prompt.
Okay.
And this can lead to fewer errors during learning. And also, since the prompt is already part of the stimulus, it's often easier to fade it out.
Okay, so it's like it's built right in, and then you can gradually make it less and less obvious.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, we've talked about a lot of different prompting and fading techniques. So for all the ABA professionals out there listening, why is this important?
It's so important because these techniques are really the foundation of how we teach skills and promote independence.
Okay.
And remember, our goal isn't to just provide prompts forever. Our goal is to teach skills in a way that leads to them being able to do things on their own.
Right. To be independent.
Exactly. And the research really emphasizes using data to guide our decisions
Right.
when we're using these techniques.
Okay. So how does that work? How does the data help us?
So we need to be collecting data on how the learner is responding to each type of prompt and each level of fading.
Okay.
And that data is going to tell us if what we're doing is working.
Okay.
It's going to tell us if we need to adjust the type of prompt or the level of fading. And it's also going to tell us when it's time to start fading the prompts out.
Okay. So the data helps us to make those decisions, like when to increase the delay, when to make the prompt less intrusive, when to take it away completely.
Exactly. Because if we don't have data, we're basically just guessing.
Okay.
And we might fade too quickly, which could lead to the learner getting frustrated or making a lot of errors.
Right.
Or we might fade too slowly, and that can lead to prompt dependence.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. So what are some challenges that ABA professionals might face when they're trying to use these techniques?
Yeah, so one big one is prompt dependency.
Okay.
So that's when a learner becomes reliant on the prompt,
Okay.
and they don't respond without it.
Even though they know how to do the skill.
Right.
Okay. So that can be a challenge. What else?
Well, fading prompts effectively can also be a challenge.
Okay.
Sometimes it can be hard to figure out how to fade those prompts out without causing errors or frustration.
Okay.
And then, of course, everyone learns differently.
Right.
So what works for one person might not work for another.
Okay. So we have to be flexible.
Exactly.
Okay. So the goal is always to transfer that stimulus control to the natural cues in the environment
Right.
so that they're responding to what's naturally there
Exactly.
and not just to our artificial prompts.
Yeah.
Okay. This has been really helpful. So let's just do a quick review.
Okay.
We talked about delayed prompting,
Right.
which is when you increase the time before giving help.
Right.
We talked about graduated prompting,
Yep. Yeah.
which is when you increase the level of assistance.
Right.
We talked about fading,
Yes.
which is the gradual removal of prompts.
Right.
And we talked about two types of fading.
Right.
Stimulus fading, which is when you're actually changing the prompt itself.
Yep.
And prompt fading, which is when you're reducing the intensity or the intrusiveness of the prompt.
Right.
And we talked about response delay, which is that pause before you give them the chance to respond.
Yes.
And then we talked about within stimulus and extra stimulus prompts.
You're right.
So within stimulus is when you're changing the thing itself.
Yep.
And extra stimulus is when you're adding cues to the environment.
Exactly.
Okay, great. So basically, all of these techniques are really important for helping people learn new skills
Absolutely.
and for promoting independence. And the research tells us that we need to use data to guide our decisions about when and how to use these techniques.
Yes.
And we also need to be aware of some of the challenges that we might face. It's
Right.
like prompt dependence and figuring out how to fade effectively.
Absolutely.
And we always want to remember that the goal is to help people be as independent as possible.
Exactly.
So as you're going about your day-to-day, think about all the things that you do automatically,
Yeah.
like tying your shoes
Right.
or making coffee.
Uh-huh.
And think about what cues in your environment
Mm-hmm.
are actually controlling those behaviors.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like the untied laces are a cue to tie your shoes.
Right.
The coffee pot is a cue to make coffee.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, we're constantly using these principles of stimulus control in our everyday lives.
Absolutely.
And once you start to understand these principles, you can start to see how they can be used to help other people.
Right.
So whether you're working with clients or maybe you're working with your own family members, understanding these principles can really help you to support them in gaining more independence.
Absolutely. And these are really just the foundational concepts. There's so much more to learn about prompting and fading and all the different ways that we can use these techniques to promote independence and positive behavior change.
This has been a great deep dive, so thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And for everyone listening out there, keep learning and keep exploring, because ABA is a fascinating field, and the more you learn, the more you can help other people.
I totally agree.
All right, we'll see you next time.
See ya.